So, my name is Szymon, and I would like to start with a question that I have for you. And how many of you have designed either some programming languages or just APIs for some services or libraries? If you did, please raise your hand. Okay, if you did, then I think that you probably have either directly or indirectly came across this question. How does a programmer think about code? And today I would like to explain you why you came across this question, and I will also try to answer this question for you. But first I want to introduce myself. So in the past I was working at the Scala compiler team until quite recently, and there I worked on the Scala 3.t compiler itself and also other projects in the Scala community, one of them being Scala Toolkit that I will mention in a moment. Now I work as a data platform engineer in Scala, but yeah, the project I will be talking about is the project from the Scala community. So okay, and when I was working on this Scala toolkit, I was researching various things about the human cognition and the understanding of programming languages, how people work with them. And when I was reading papers on that, I came across a quite interesting quote. And these authors of the paper that I was reading said that designing programming languages only marginally involves empirical evidence, and instead experience and plausibility are used. And it quite resonated with me, with a general approach that I felt that a lot of the programming language designers are taking. So I thought, yeah, maybe let's think about that. So let's set a scenario for today, what we are going to do. Let's imagine that we are all tasked with designing a good and simple language or API. The good part is, I think, very hard. The simple part is also very hard. And they are both very broad words, but let's try to focus on simple for now. And it's very hard to define it. It's a very subjective term. It depends on a person. It means a lot of stuff. Every person that says it may mean something different. But we can try to define it. And I want to propose a cognitive model for that. I want us to start with cognition, to think about the simplicity, because cognition is the foundation of the way we and our users of our libraries and languages read code and interact with it. So okay, let's quickly dive into it. A simplified model of cognition that's kind of agreed upon is that we have some senses that help us with reading the code, that we see the symbols in the code with. Then we have our working memory, where we kind of load the symbols, and it's a short-term, small-size memory. It contains about 7 chunks. I will tell you what the chunks exactly are. And it's not exactly 7, that's a general number, a rule of 7 that some people have agreed upon, but it's quite not that well defined. And we also have the long-term memory that we store our long-term information with, so our knowledge, our experience, and that helps us work with the code as well. So what are the chunks? Chunks are pieces of information that we store in our working memory. In general, we group the information that we have in our working memory into chunks. Okay, I will try to explain it to you with an experiment. So there, in a moment, there will appear a digit sequence, and I want you to try to remember as much of them in a correct order as you can. There will be there for 10 seconds. Okay, how many do you remember? Maybe if you remember more than 6, I'll give you a moment. If you remember 6 or more, please raise your hand. Okay, that's quite good. 6 is good. And now another experiment, a simpler one. Now there will be some dates that I want to remember again in 10 seconds. Okay, so how many of you remember at least one date from that? That's more people, and actually those were the same digits. Those were the same digits, it's just they were ordered in a date. Because our brain is pretty much better at remembering and thinking about stuff that we are familiar with. We are able to store it differently as chunks in our working memory. In the first example, we stored them as digits. In the second example, we have thought about them as dates that we are used to thinking about and we can think about more efficiently. So it's the unit, these chunks are the unit that we operate on in our working memory. We can also think about programming, chunks in programming. So for example, if we had a code like this in Scala, some people here may be familiar with Scala, but most of the programmers are not that good with the syntax. It's a syntax that is not so commonly used in Scala, and for many people, semantics will be unknown. And if you look at it, it won't be probably possible to store all of that in your working memory. As you can see, there are more than 7 chunks. You'll look at it and you'll have a trouble understanding that. You'll have to Google that, you'll have to do all kinds of stuff to understand it. But on the other hand, if the same code was written out like this, then you would be able to comprehend it as a whole, because it's written in a, one may say a better way, but in general, that utilizes better what we know about the programming, what we know about the language. It has suggests names for you and suggests by the names what it does. So you are able, without changing the context, merge it into these chunks and comprehend it as a whole, and go on with reading the code, the latter pieces of the code. And now let's define something called cognitive load that will help us very much soon. So this cognitive load would be this amount of information that we process in our working memory. The more chunks you have in your working memory that you have to think about, the more cognitive load you have within a task. In our model, I suggest that can be the main limitation in the code comprehension. So when you require your users to think about more stuff, to have more complex structure in their working memory, then you impose on them more cognitive load. And in all of that, I think we can suggest that the simplicity that we were talking about before can be described at least partially with cognitive load. And it simplifies a lot of stuff for us now, if you want to build a model of this library design. So let's go ahead with that, and let's continue. Because that's not all there is. There is also the way we understand the code, how we think about it, and how we read it. So when we try to understand the code, in general, we apply 2 approaches. Of course, in a simplified model, there is a bottom-up approach and the top-down approach. The simpler of them, the top-down approach, in general, is understanding the meaning of the code as it appears to be. We are not going deep into all the details of the code. We are not reading all the symbols and putting them together. Instead, we try to find patterns in the code that we know. We go over it, and we can understand it without going into the details. So for example, if we had a code like this, if one is familiar in general with applications that work with JSONs, send some stuff, there's a code that fetches a JSON, processes it, and sends an email. And in general, many people wouldn't even read the right-hand side of these expressions because they are familiar with these patterns, and they don't need to go deep into that because it's quite simple. But on the other hand, when code gets quite complicated, we may be forced to apply the bottom-up approach. And that means that we'll go deeper. We'll try to look at all the symbols to find anything that we could have missed if we don't understand something. We'll go through it. We'll go in the opposite direction. We'll merge these chunks into higher level chunks that make us understand the code as a whole. We also employ that when we debug the code, where there is some pattern that we kind of thought that works like this. We wrote this code, but in the end, it doesn't really work like that. So we have to go deeper and understand the details of it and go over all of that. For example, that's a very simple code. That's not the one that would usually require bottom-up comprehension, but for an example, and also assuming that you also only fit 4 chunks in your memory, one would read the code, not fully understand it, so he would need to change the context that he has. He would need to, for example, Google what map does. He would need to Google arrow syntax in Scala. Then he would be able to understand the symbols that would then fit into his working memory, and then he can go. You just read the code later. You can just go on. So putting it all together, when we read code in our model, we have these symbols that we read. We have the working memory that we read the symbols in their meaning into, and where we integrate them with the cognitive process that employs the top-down and bottom-up comprehension. And we also have our long-term memory that has all the information, that our knowledge about programming, our experience, etc. So I'll leave it here for a second so we can look at it. Okay. And when I was researching all of that, one thing that I found very interesting is that in the area of, in general, researching how people think about the code, there is an interesting direction that there are researchers that actually employ fMRI machines and what they basically do is have these MRI machines and put people that are somewhat familiar with programming, have some experience with that, stick up a screen in front of their faces, and then code appears on that, and they are meant to understand what this code does, to simulate it, to like run it in their heads. And then they measure something called BOLD in their brains. It's basically the blood oxygen level. It's correlated with, it's supposed to be correlated with the activity in the area of the brain, because if you're not familiar with that, we have some understanding of what certain parts of the brain do. So yeah, they did that to understand it better, and they found out that the parts that are especially involved are these Bachmann areas, that's the name for these parts of the brains, and they even plotted this bold signal over time. But in general, the parts that are especially involved were parts that we think are responsible for the working memory and semantic memory retrieval. So yeah, I think that's quite interesting. I then even went ahead and proposed a model on the brain that we have this area that corresponds to keeping values in the mind. Then we have this process of analyzing words and symbols that would kind of correspond to the cognitive process I told you about. And we also have this process of integrating the statements and chunks when we read and understand the code. But I think it all boils down to a simple thing, that you should take care of your colleague's brain when you write a code at your company or a library. So I think many of these things I was talking about and results of them are things that we already know. So you shouldn't feel the working memory of people that work with your library or a language. So you should use short functions that don't have too much logic in them. You should use good variable names. You should not make too big modules, so it can all be comprehended at once without changing context and, for example, grabbing a card or notes. You should also allow for top-down comprehension when possible, and that pretty much amounts, for example, to, again, using good variables names and patterns. And even maybe some patterns, so when even a code is hard, that would go into the bottom-up comprehension area. So even when some code is hard, then one can focus on the stuff that is actually hard and not focus on some patterns that they're unfamiliar with. And we can also think how it applies to writing the code. And that's another proposition I have for a model. So in general, I think that we could say that we start with a goal chunk and we finish with the code that is a structure of chunks on different abstraction level that is reducible to the goal chunk. So when we read that code, we would kind of go in this different direction. So for example, as you can see here, we have a goal and a higher level of abstraction, and we have steps that are meant to accomplish this goal on a lower level of abstraction. If you were to send an HTTP request, for example, in our code, you would have this goal that we have. We would have some intermediate things that would write out in our own code, and then there would be some abstraction at the library level that would take care of all the stuff inside for us. And from that, we can kind of derive a rule of thumb for abstraction. So I think in this model, a good abstraction would be one that consists of about 4 to 5 lower level chunks. So when we have some method in our library, then maybe we should limit ourselves to that. So when somebody wants to understand what's going on, then they can just swiftly move all over it without this strange moment when you go into a library function, you have all this long function ahead of you, and you have to scroll through it, and you have a very hard time understanding it. I think that if we use this rule, then we would limit that problem for our users. And now let's apply it to a specific problem that I had. And that was the Scala Toolkit. Scala Toolkit is still meant to be an ecosystem of battle-tested libraries. So not a library of its own, rather a compilation of libraries that are slightly modified from the Scala ecosystem and that are already widely adopted, that prioritizes ease of use and good developer experience, and has a property of some really scalable experience to it. So it's both good for newcomers and experienced developers. So in the end, it would be, it's actually pretty much already is, an extension to the Scala standard library that would allow solving some common problems on different level of experience. And to achieve that goal, we used a tool that is pretty much compatible with the model I showed you before and that we worked on, because it's not something that we made up. It's the cognitive dimensions framework, that's what I'm talking about, are a tool that was used first by UX researchers when working on in general on notations, not only on programming languages. Then it was adopted at Microsoft and working on .NET platform. And then we worked on it to adapt it to our needs. And in essence, this is a framework that can be used to assess the cognitive load of a given code or a library and their definitions. It's a set of dimensions that helps with that. And the first step of what you do when you apply it is you think about your target user, because there is no universally good library. You have to think about what is your aim, who you target your code and your tool set. So for the Scala Toolkit, the target was the users that might not be necessarily that familiar with complex features of Scala language. They may be, but may also not. And that they want to write some either scripts, prototypes, or simple services. And that's at least that. Maybe also some bigger services if it fits well, but we wanted to at least accomplish that. And the second step when applying these cognitive dimensions is to set up this test scenario for usability. You have to think about a specific case, what happens, what problem you're trying to solve. So for example, that would be reading the whole file to find the words occurring most frequently in it. And first of these cognitive dimensions that we used was the abstraction level. And all of these cognitive dimensions answer a question. For simplicity, we decided that they either answer question yes or no. It's 1 or 0, no in between. And the question that abstraction level was answering was whether the abstraction level would feel natural for a target user. And is the code that in the library, is the API that we are offering on this level of abstraction. So for example, when we would have a Scala code that is meant to read code, if you're not familiar with Scala, you may not know some of the stuff here, but to draw a broad picture, we have there a file reader that accepts some higher-kinded type, and then we read file with from a path that returns an instance of this higher-kinded type with wrapped in that includes this string. So that allows a very nice abstraction, somewhat nice abstraction. It's kind of pretty much the standard, I think, in many libraries, for reading file in various ways in your code. So you could have a synchronous file reader or an asynchronous file reader, and also probably something that is fileable and etc., error handling. And for our use case, it's an excessive abstraction over the execution for the target user. And that's because they may not know the idea of abstraction, or what abstracting over the execution means. So going over specific areas that are affected when the abstraction level dimension doesn't work that well. So from the long-term memory, we impose on the user the requirement to understand this given abstraction. For example, over the execution model. If they come from other programming language, they may not have that, and that will be a cost for them in their understanding and working with that library. From the working memory perspective, we have to include in our working memory the concept of this execution model that we chose. It's not just a plain string that we can assume there is. We have to store it there. So it's also a cost. Everything that we put there that's more than the baseline is a cost and makes it harder to work with. And from the top-down and bottom-up comprehension perspective, the execution model exists in the code. We can look at it, and there are parts of it that are responsible for it. So it's an additional information that we have to take into account during this comprehension, both top-down and bottom-up. It may, for example, disrupt a pattern that we already know. That, for example, we know how this code would work without this I/O, but then I/O appears and we have no idea. So clever abstraction is cool, but I think that we should concentrate on its purpose and consequences. So in general, I'm not saying that this approach is bad always, but we have to think about our target user, and in our case, it was not the best idea. Another example would be the role expressiveness. So if somebody was to, without experience working with the code, someone without experience working with our code, could he quickly recognize what each part of the library and our code does? For example, if we had a library that used a very nice and smart operations on this HTTP request, that would, for example, exclamation mark sends and request, and also there are other operations to work with that request, then it's short, but on the other hand, there is no way of knowing what it actually does. So when somebody new comes to the code base, there is no way, and he has to change the context again. He can't understand it. On the other hand, if we use some notations that are based on the pre-existing knowledge of the user, that lowers the cognitive load, because he doesn't need to know that. The last example that I want to show, there are more of them, but the last of them is visibility. So if you have some library and you don't go into the documentation, you have this constant context, you focus on your IDE, how easy is it to you to discover certain notation and follow its rules? So for example, you have some information about this request returned, and you want to go over the headers or anything in there. So how easy would that be without going into documentation? There were also other cognitive dimensions that we used, so it was consistency, so how library is consistent within itself, how well it corresponds to the domain, that would be the domain correspondence. Also the conceptual similarity. Inside the toolkit, we wanted the libraries to be similar conceptually and do not have behaviors that would confuse because they work differently in different libraries, and also others. We also use other analysis methods that I think were really helpful. Language level was that we didn't want the libraries to use too complex language features. The structural measures were very interesting because they worked automatically and we are able to run them on the code and find, for example, if the definitions are consistent, what is the complexity of the functions, and many others that I won't go over, but they were important, like whether the library is tested, are the maintainers responsible, etc. So in the end, when we were applying it in the Scala Toolkit, we have built a certain, went over libraries in the ecosystem that solve a given problem. For example, a JSON parsing. We pre-selected them with some initial conditions. Then we created spreadsheets and forms to rate them in our team. And we have very strict definitions about these cognitive dimensions that we wanted to use. And then we rated them. We chose the one that we thought fitted the best. And then we, with the feedback that we got from thinking about with these cognitive dimensions, we went on and improved on them. So for example, Adrian from the Scala Center worked on a very popular library in Scala STTP and used the insight on the abstraction level dimension to change the API a bit so it works better with our target users. And it was quite well received within the community, so I think it worked quite well. There were also features that we added to the libraries and other things. Yeah. So in the end, as I said, we ended up with libraries for JSON, working with JSONs, HTTP, files, and testing. And we also wanted to apply the smooth user experience to the whole experience of using the toolkit. So to do that, we used the fact that what the Scala compiler team is doing is changing the tool that is the command line tool for Scala from the default one to Scala CLI. And Scala CLI allows usage of something called using directives. So on top of a file, you can write this using toolkit latest, for example, that works even now. And you don't need to set up any project, you don't need to do anything. You can just have a script that has this on the top. And then you can use all these tools that you want to write your script. And everything is taken care of for you. We also created Q&A-like tutorials that are kind of like Stack Overflowy, but more structured. So when somebody Googles something, they'll just see it, hopefully as a first result, and they can just go into it and see that, okay, you can do it quite simply in Scala, even in an idiomatic way. And another thing I think is very important that is very often glanced over and is also influences usability quite seriously is when the compatibility breaks. So what we did is we have a whole dependency of tree of the toolkit taken into account. We go over it, and for each dependency, even the transitive ones inside our libraries, we run checks that they do not break server compatibility. So in the end, we generate a changelog that contains all the changes to the both direct and indirect dependencies and the full dependency tree. So if somebody wants to look into that, they can. It's also very much helpful to us because we can see what is happening inside of the toolkit exactly. And it's not the only toolkit that was created. The type level is an organization in Scala that creates a lot of very good libraries for functional programming, and they created a toolkit of their own. It's called type level toolkit. So in the end, toolkit became kind of a standard rather than a single tool. So yeah, you can also type, for example, in Scala CLI using toolkit type level and use like a functional programming toolkit of your liking. That's also possible in Scala right now. If you want to take part in toolkit, because if you were thinking to maybe join the open source and write something, I think the libraries that are in toolkit are quite good choice of things that you can work for a starter to contribute to something in the open source, but you can also discuss the toolkit in the GitHub repository or take on even the part of the discussion on Discord, Scala Discord that we have. So okay, wrapping it up. Our task was to design a good and simple language or API. And I am not sure about good. I hope we did good, but I think that we got closer to simple. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Do we have questions? I see one there.
So this is a question mostly relating to this slide that you showed, the MRI scans.
Which one?
The brain scans. Because
I didn't hear you, sorry.
The brain MRI scans, that slide. One thing I wanted to address is there's a lot of different brains, right? There's a lot of different ways that brains can work. If you try to scan a wide diversity of brains, you find that they work in very different ways, and the different bits are more or less active, larger, smaller, and it just differs very widely across the population. But if you take a small sample, like people familiar with programming, right, you're going to get a very narrow range of brain types. So I'm wondering if when you were doing your research, when you were trying to get a neuroscience-based approach, how much thought did you give to sort of the diversity of brains, how to counter that bias that you might find in the research?
Okay, so I did not conduct any of that research. That was more of a, as I said, it was the papers that I cited here, and I was reading all over them, and actually I remember there were sections about what you were telling, so I'll tell you in a moment. And I also want to say that it's very hard to draw any hard conclusions from that. It's not something that we understand that well. I just maybe put it here as a direction that we may want to take, to like encourage, because I think that's a good idea. But to address the differences between the brains, from what I remember, there was a certain process. So for one, there is the structural differences, so the mapping of the parts that are responsible for different things. And from what I remember, the studies accounted for them. They did certain like preparatory things that they tried to not just have this input data and like from all these brains and put it all together. They actually mapped this, they actually did some mapping of it and tried to have as much insight into the specific people, into their specific insights as they could. But on the other hand, as for the sampling, that's true. You have the samples were people that were familiar with programming, and that's, I think, quite a risk. I think that's something that has to be taken into account, because I think that the programming community is changing, and if you only take into account usability for people that are already programming, that may not be such a good idea. Yeah.
I really liked your takeaways on how to make things easier to understand. I would like to know how does it differ if I'm trying to target experienced programmers versus people that are not experienced in the target language or the target libraries? I understand that your goal was to make it better for both of them. So what is the difference when I'm targeting one or the other?
Okay, so the thing is that the toolkit was, one of the goals of the toolkit was to improve the adoption of Scala. So I think there is two different aspects of being an experienced developer. You can have a general broad knowledge of programming, like you understand many of things, and you can have a good knowledge of a specific tool. And when you already have a good knowledge of a specific tool, a lot of costs that I showed you here was not that heavy, because all these weird notations, you're already familiar with them, etc. So I think the place where this process works the most is when you see something new, because otherwise you already have invested some time into that and understand it. And I'm not sure about that. I didn't prepare it for this case. But when you're an experienced developer, on the other hand, then it's just a different target user. So as I was saying, we are targeting this user that is beginner, etc. But we could have also targeted the users that know good understanding of the abstraction level. And in that case, looking at higher kinded types and this I/O and such doesn't have really that much impact on them. They can just, you just don't think of it as that much of a cost. It's not a cost for these specific areas. They're not that impacted. That was the approach that we took.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. You mentioned at the beginning about looking inside people's heads and talking about the lack of empirical input into this. Have you thought about testing the old version of the library against a new one to see if it is indeed simpler and better? With real users.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea. We didn't exactly do that. We were more like testing the libraries that are already here. But I think that we could test it, for example, for the STTP change, the one that we did. I don't have like much longer answer for you, because we just didn't have this differential rating. We just mainly have it like to differentiate between libraries in the specific test cases, and then to maybe by that and based on interviews know what's to improve there and then improve it in that areas.
Okay, so you did some interviewing?
Yeah, we did.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. Very interesting. So the description in the program, it mentioned that you also came up with some guidelines and rules how to write the code to make it easily understandable. Could you give any examples of those?
The rules?
Yes, like rules and guidelines that you guys agreed on to make it more easy for the brain to understand.
Okay, so they depend on the language, and I think I will say it partially, but I think it will be easier for me to say it for the Scala language. So you can go over various dimensions. That's what they were for in there. So as I was saying, for example, from the perspective of consistency, that's a very, very strong one. There are some libraries that, for example, have different way of error handling. And what we've seen is people struggle with, they, for example, write one function that makes a request, and then it throws an error, but other function, and instead of throwing an error, it includes it in the response object. So that would be one rule. So to avoid this confusion, this point when people are like, they have to change context and think, what's happening here? You just have to be consistent. That's one thing. That's quite, I think, obvious in ways, but for us, it kind of opened another way of thinking about them. And also the patterns. When you apply some patterns, you can, I think that in many languages, people create DSLs that are new. There are libraries that propose DSLs that are meant to be like nice and good to work with and faster. But I think that the thing that is often not that taken into account is that you can have a DSL that's very smart and maybe has less of code, but it has a very high cost at the beginning because it's new to people. And it's pretty much lower cost for them to use something they already know and maybe have some sprinkle of something new, but to have this pattern, to use this pattern recognition that we have. That, for example, tools, for example, yeah.
So that's a bit of a tangent from the topic of your talk, but in your research, have you found any information about, like, so when I code something new, like truly new to myself, I often don't really know where I'm going. I write an implementation that's kind of bad, and then I iterate over it, and then it's still bad, and maybe five rewrites down the line, it's kind of good, right? So when you're going through that process, are there any patterns to help you get to the good thing quicker, or like be less bad?
So I think that you may be suffering from a tool that you may be suffering from a tool in that case, because I think that it's the role of the tool that you're using to guide you, and it also depends on the problem. I think that if you have a domain that's hard and you just implement it in this, there's not much. There's often, if the problem is hard, there's often, I think, not that much that can help you, but a bit the tool, if the tool knows what their users do, I think it can guide you quite well. So there are also, this is like kind of also a tooling question, because I think there can be suggestions. That's something that we worked in Scala, for example. Something that may appear in the future is like this. There's also the ChatGPT going on, but aside from that, there may be like this, the suggestions that are aware of what you're doing, and we even wanted to do that with Toolkit, so you would be able to generate snippets of the code, maybe something like this. But I don't have a very clear answer because it depends on the tool.
Thank you. I have a confession to make. Many years ago, I designed an API, quite simple, only 5 operations. 2 of them took 3 parameters, the same 3 parameters in 2 different orders. And that's an example that I learned, I just didn't see it at the time, but I learned after a while that it was a mistake. I wonder whether that specific idea, which is applicable to virtually any programming language, is one that you've come across and dealt with, or if there are other things around, at that level that you could give us that will help me to avoid making mistakes like that in the future.
Yeah, so the thing that the order of the parameters is actually one of the easier ones to detect, because the structural measures that I told you before, it doesn't require much process, because there are already tools that can automatically detect things like this. So you have tools that go over your code, and when you have a different order, like parameters going on in various orders, then it will detect it for you, kind of like linting, and tell it apart for you. And also other things that it can detect for you. So those simple things can be even automatically fixed.
Okay, more questions?
Hi, very much enjoyed the talk. How do you, so for you, obviously this is different for everyone, but for you, how do you balance like programmatic simplicity and the effectiveness of the program in terms of resource and memory cost with the act of communication that you're describing for other developers that have to use your tooling? How do you balance the effectiveness of the program versus how easy it is to work with?
Oh, you mean the effectiveness of programming, not the performance of the code, but
the application effectiveness versus the programmer experience.
Yeah, okay. So that's another thing. Yeah, that's something that we also looked into when we wanted to make this experience scalable. So I think that at some point, problems appear that have just a different structure to them, the different specification. When you have an application that is meant to, for example, be highly distributed and scale or you have a lot of concurrency in it, then it's just like you have to find a good middle, and that's what experienced developers tend to very often work on. That you have to, for example, this abstraction over the execution fits very well into that, because otherwise, if it was like a, let's say, simple library, then it wouldn't work that well, because you would need to add even some custom, not standard ways to handle that. But from what we've seen, there is not much difference if a library is good for there is, I think that there is a way to build a library that's good for beginners and advanced people for scripting and prototyping and simple services. That there is not much like difference in there. So when you get experienced, a simple library at the beginning will still be effective and probably good to work with. It's just the problems that may scale.
Okay. So maybe last final question from there.
So you had a slide where you were saying something like if you use very like advanced abstractions, then it hurts both on the short-term and on the long-term memory level, because long-term, you have to keep more in mind than short-term, because then you have to load them into your cache to work with them. I would challenge that. I would think that these two effects are going in opposite directions. Like, sure, you might have to have some long-term cost, but like the highest level of long-term memory you can have is intuition. And if you are able to import your intuition about some high-level concept, that means it frees up your short-term resources, right? So there might be some advanced concept that you might think, okay, well, it's not worth putting into the code. But for people who understand that concept, that might mean that the particular application of it requires much less effort to use, because they can just, like I said, they can just use their intuition. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, I agree with you. That's the thing about targeting, finding the target user. But I think there are two things. There's the first thing that you said. If you use an approach that you can be familiar with and that is consistent and is like the default within your code, and even if that's the one that requires some intuition that's different from the basic one that you had like at uni or anything, then it may be the same and it may just be a different target user. But on the other hand, with this different ways of increasing complexity, what often happens is that there's another like dimension to your code. For example, when you have, again, this example I go over and over again, but this abstraction abstraction over the execution, you have IO types, you have just types, and even if you have a strong intuition for that, then there are still pieces of code that corresponds to operating on that. You can have monad transformers on anything, and you have to operate on that and work with that. Even if you're very familiar with that, if you are operating on just single type, a string, all this code wouldn't be there. So you wouldn't need to think about it, and that's what I think. Impacts your working memory, even if you're a more experienced developer. On the other hand, it's very often useful to use that if it solves the problems, for example, of concurrency, of handling the errors, etc., that otherwise would be non-standard and work in a way that you are not familiar with, or you can't be familiar with because they're just complex.
Right, but even in this example, like if you don't use this abstraction over the computational effects, that means you will end up with more code, right? Because you will have code that's specific to synchronous and code that's specific to asynchronous execution. And that also has a cost, because now there's more code to look at. I need to keep in mind, like, I need to discover first that, okay, these are actually doing the same thing, just with a different execution model. So
yeah,
it's not as clear cut.
You have to find the middle always. Like it's always, there are drawbacks and benefits to that. But there are reasons why I'm not saying that it's not bad that people do that. I very often use that, this approach. In general, I write code like this. But yeah, I'm just saying that it may not be always the best.
Okay, so let's give a warm round of applause to Szymon.